in the center of this hole. Any other thoughts on what the gravitational force is if I do that? Any other guesses out there? Come on, let's come up with some wild guesses. Let's go back to this picture for a second. If I'm standing here at the surface of the Earth, what is the force of gravity on me? Thomas, what's the force of gravity on me up there?
Negative G.
Okay. Negative, we draw with an arrow down. It's got a value of G. I have to multiply by my mass, of course. And so it's mg. What about when I'm over here? Austin, what do you think? What's the force there?
Mg, then upwards towards the center.
Mg upwards. And look, if I'm over here, then it's mg that way. And if I'm over there, then it's mg that way. So Austin, what do you think? What's the force at the center of the Earth?
I would think it would encompass you and cancel each other out.
Exactly right. The force at the center of the Earth is equal to 0. There is no gravity there. Specifically, there's no gravitational force. Why is that?
The unified field theory. For the uninitiated, the unified field theory is essentially a mathematical statement from Einstein to support his idea of a link between electromagnetism and gravity. Just like his famous E equals mc squared equation showing energy and mass are one and the same thing, the unified field equations are also designed to show electromagnetism and gravity as being one and the same thing too. Of course, the biggest question on everyone's mind is, did Einstein succeed in his work?
Electric force that is 39 orders of magnitude stronger than the force of gravity.
Textbooks and scientific journals have told us for many years that our tides are mainly caused by the pull exerted on the Earth by the Moon. On September 8, 1968, Wright had reason to question that pulling action when his 12-year-old son Tom told him he didn't believe a pull by the Moon could cause our tides. He asked Wright how a pull by the Moon could cause two separate high tides on Earth at the same time. One high tide on the side of the Earth that faces the Moon, and another high tide on the opposite side of the Earth, away from the Moon. These two high tides are depicted in this drawing on the screen.
In quantum atom theory, electromagnetic radiation creates Einstein's curvature of space-time, creating the gravitational force. Light will always take the simplest and most efficient path, expanding out in all directions, forming light spheres of electromagnetic radiation. Because it is impossible to achieve absolute zero, all atoms radiate electromagnetic radiation continuously, and it is the outward momentum of this electromagnetic radiation that forms the inward force of gravity. The radiating energy will be entirely absorbed proportionally to the masses within the objects. This will cause an unbalanced force. Therefore, all objects resonate together. Because atoms consist mostly of empty space, electromagnetic radiation of short wavelengths, like X-rays, can penetrate the objects. Therefore, every single part of matter can take part in the gravitational interaction. Therefore, the greater the mass of atoms, the stronger the gravitational force. The gravitational field will propagate at the speed of light. Therefore, there is no instantaneous action at a distance. We have the inverse square law because the surface area of the light sphere increases with the square of the radius. Thus the strength of the gravitational field is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source.
In 1968, Wright arrived at a planet orbiting theory similar to that of Kepler's back in the 16th century. Kepler observed during that early period of astronomical history that all the known planets orbited the sun counterclockwise. This led him to believe that the sun was rotating counterclockwise and that somehow the sun's power swept the planets around it in a counterclockwise direction. Years later, when the telescope was invented, scientists discovered that the sun does rotate counterclockwise. The planet orbiting model on the screen was built by Wright 15 years ago and operates in the following manner. The motor in the center, representing the sun, has a fan blade attached and turns in a counterclockwise direction. This movement of the blade creates a whirlwind effect which simulates the sun's sweeping or pushing magnetic lines of force. This sweeping action, in turn, reaches out beyond the planets and moves Mercury and Earth around the sun in their counterclockwise orbits, as shown on the screen. In this model, the mathematical ratios as far as planet size, distance from the sun, and orbiting speed are accurate. This model also supports Einstein's theory that orbiting bodies move on invisible tracks, or as Wright says, they orbit on unseen magnetic railroad tracks.
Explains that the photon is absorbed in the orbit of the electron, speeds down to zero, hits the core of the atom, reverses its flow, and speed up again, hitting the orbit of the electron once again, and continues its travel by the speed of light.
A particular example of this is when a wave is breaking near the seashore. A wave that's travelled with a more or less sine-shaped wave, when it arrives near the seashore and the shore and the water gets less deep, the tops of the waves now travel faster than the bottoms of the waves, and they overtake them and the wave breaks. And this complicated thing that happens when the wave breaks is something akin to what's going on near the centres of particles, where a more complicated thing goes on and energy is lost to harmonics, and other frequencies are given off or created within that particle. And this is how the whole universe arises, from this nonlinearity.
The electric force that is 39 orders of magnitude stronger than the force of gravity. Quite unlike by the effect of gravity, plasma particles also do repel one another by the electric force. This happens between particles of like polarity. However, the opposite happens when the attracting particles come extremely close to one another. The reason is that the universe would not function without this additional principle. For example, if electrons were merely attracted to protons, they would latch onto one another. As a result, nothing would move. The electrons would simply remain stuck there. Nothing useful would result. But this doesn't happen. Nowhere in the universe can we find electrons latched onto protons. Before they would latch on, the electrons rebound. Instead of getting stuck by being latched onto protons at close distances, the electrons bounce away from the protons, like a rubber ball rebounds when it hits a wall. By this rebounding effect, the electrons become drawn into an endless dance around the protons in plasma. They are attracted from afar and repelled at close distances, only to become attracted anew. The same principle may, on a large scale, cause a repulsive barrier to form against the electron dance, past the specific plasma density, which repels electrons out of the dense plasma regions, somewhat like oil floating on water. This means that the visible surface on the sun that we see isn't actually a surface in the standard sense, but is merely a density-determined zone where all the plasma interactions take place, including the fusion reactions.
Black hole sun, won't you come wash away the rain? Black hole sun, won't you come, won't you come?
Whole new meaning on that song lyric, Black Hole Sun. Scientists at NASA have given us some amazing images, and they've discovered there's actually an enormous dark hole over our sun. Corey Powell's editor at large is.
When plasma is motivated by the electric force, which is 39 orders of magnitude stronger than mass and gravity, chains of highly efficient nuclear reactions occur. They occur right on the surface of the sun, where the plasma meets the sun's reaction cells. In the fusion reaction on the surface of the sun, all the atomic elements are synthesized that the planets are made of. The synthesized atoms then flow away with the solar wind. During the early phase of the sun, all the atoms for the planets were created by the sun and carried in the solar winds till they fell out and condensed into planets. This, in short, is how the solar system was created, near the center of the galaxy, and how it still functions fundamentally, though with lesser intensity.
Gravity is not a real force at all. It is a secondary force to the electromagnetic force. Objects just freefall towards the greatest energy because it has the slowest rate of time, or the greatest time dilation. I believe this can be seen in the mathematics, with both the gravitational force and the electromagnetic force having the inverse square law. We have the inverse square law because the surface area of the light sphere increases with the square of the radius. Thus the strength of the gravitational field is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source. There is no mysterious action at a distance. The gravitational field will work at the speed of light because it is an integral part of one universal process with the electromagnetic force. We have one universal process that begins with the quantum wave particle function or probability function of quantum mechanics, expanding out as an inverse sphere, and ends with the inverse square law of gravity and Newton's third law of motion. To every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Gravity is the opposite reaction to the atoms radiating quantized spherical wavefronts of electromagnetic radiation. We have one interactive, universal process continuously unfolding at the quantum level of the atoms. We see and feel this process as time, as a physical process of continuous energy exchange that is formed light-photon oscillation by light-photon oscillation. Objects form their own time by slowing up the rate that time flows, relative to their energy and momentum. Gravity is not a real force at all.
Have you ever wondered why we have heard about a force called gravity our entire lives, and yet nobody has ever been able to prove that it exists? even though untold numbers of experiments have been performed seeking its cause? Academics have proposed many strange solutions to their mythical gravity by inventing many theories about gravitational attraction. Inward pulling gravity, gravitons, gravity waves, 4D warped space and time, to name just a few. It is even claimed that gravity has a velocity, though nobody can explain what is traveling to create this invented force. Scientists do not even know how their mythical force operates, whether it is graviton particles, gravity waves, a strange, unexplainable force which acts at a distance through empty space, or a four-dimensional warped space and time delusion. We have all heard about this inward pulling force called gravity from the academic scientists, and its warped cousin conjured up by Einstein, yet no one has ever discovered the power source for its never-ending pulling force, or its ability to warp space and time perpetually throughout eternity. This theory violates the conservation of energy law, so it cannot be validated using the very foundational formulas, laws, or equations cherished by academics themselves, and requires a kind of religious faith in its existence, since it cannot be seen, proved, nor validated. Have you ever heard that astronomers believe that gravity knows, as if it has consciousness, just how much force to dole out to the various heavenly bodies according to how much mass they have? Newton added the product of two masses to Kepler's third equation without justification, which has created all of this confusion, since mass is not the cause of the effects attributed to the myth called gravity. For example, academics believe that the Sun pulls on Jupiter 300 times harder than the Earth, because these astronomers believe that Jupiter has 300 times more mass than Earth. Academic astronomers claim that the Sun pulls on all heavenly bodies in our solar system with a different amount of force according to how much mass they have. How this could happen is never explained, nor is it remotely tenable. Anyone with common sense can see this is absurd, and would reject this proposition if they knew what these so-called astronomers actually believe and have faith in as their science of gravity. The uncritical acceptance of this absurd theory is what this book exposes. Patti Spolter proved in her work that the product of two masses which Newton added to Kepler's third equation is fallacious, and that Kepler's third equation, area times acceleration, is the math that accurately describes the motions of heavenly bodies. This means that Newton's so-called universal law of gravitation, based on the product of two masses, is in fact false. Newton's formula for universal gravitation gives sums which are off by many orders of magnitude when comparing the various motions of the heavenly bodies within our solar system, unlike the uniform results created using Kepler's third equation of area times acceleration. It is claimed by academia that gravity is responsible for the formation of the Big Bang universe, which, as anyone with discernment knows, is an impossibility as well, and that without gravity, the universe would be without thermal energy and composed only of equally spaced particles. The answer has been staring academics in the face for several generations now. Electric laws were unknown to Newton in his time. However, now we know with great accuracy the effects of electricity as obeying the inverse square law. The fact is that so-called magnetism, which in reality is electricism, light, sound, and radiation are all electric motions. All motion in the universe is electric. This is why the myth called gravity conforms to the inverse square law, since it is electric force which creates the effects falsely attributed to the fictitious force called gravity. Electric force in all forms, scales, and pressures, from the elements to the galaxies, obey this foundational inverse square law. In the course of this book, gravity is a myth and does not exist. Electricity is the only force in the universe. It will be shown that the force called gravity, which was created by Newton and later modified by Einstein and others, does not exist and is purely mythical in its creation. The consequences of this conclusion are immense. It means that a huge list of non-existent entities have been invented by academic scientists based on the mathematics.
Despite what is being observed, things are assigned to them simply because of the way science now believes things. For instance, black holes are found everywhere now. They're at the centers of galaxies. They're floating around all over the place. They have different sizes. They're from micro size up to ultra supermassive size. But the fact remains that nobody has ever found a black hole. All alleged reports of black hole discoveries only pertain to things that they say are black holes because it's a belief system. So the problem is, with all of these experiments, nobody can verify anything and must rely upon what one party says. So all the money that's being spent on these experiments is not forwarding science at all, and is in fact limiting science to certain dogmatic views that one can't use any experimental data to confirm or deny.
So what are they looking for? They're looking for a phantasm. It's always been a phantasm. And why? Based on completely unrealistic or incorrect analysis of the field equations and Einstein's theory.
We're talking about the wave structure of matter. For 3,000 years, everybody has thought that matter had to be little bits of sand, little particles, just like the Greeks thought. I think most scientists, they made sand castles on the beach. When you make a sand castle, you begin to think, well, this is the substance of which matter really is. So it's pretty hard for them to get rid of these ideas. But the truth of the matter is, all the experiments, the observations that scientists make agrees that there has to be a wave structure of matter, and only wave structure.
What's wrong with the particles?
They just don't fit.
Why?
They don't match up with the observation. There's a thing called a wave-particle duality, and it's a big puzzle. Sometimes a particle looks like a wave, or at least what people think is a particle. They all tend to look like waves if they get small enough, because they are waves. The photon, for example, energy goes from here over to here. Nobody sees it move, so they make up a particle called a photon. Never identified, and it violates all the laws of electricity and magnetism, of which it is supposed to be made, but it isn't. So this is a great puzzle created by particle notions. Nobody explains it. It just happens. This is the religion of science. Nature is like the church. If you don't understand something, you just say it happens. Nature did it that way. And you stop thinking, stop looking for answers. The mathematical physicists are perhaps the most deceptive of the lot, because they tend to pull the wool over everybody's eyes. They got all the A's in the algebra and calculus classes, and all the rest of the scientists are kind of afraid of them. So they get to make more speculation than anybody else. What people think are particles are spherical wave structures consisting of an outgoing wave combined with an in wave. Mathematicians are fairly happy with this because these are the only two possible solutions of the equations. So that part is okay. Now the center of this structure behaves just like a particle. The only problem is not many people know it yet, because not many people have investigated it.
Hey, you said that new force was fake. If it's actually gravity, doesn't that make the gravity with the Earth also fake? Yep, gravity, not a real force. So how does an acceleration in one frame look like a force in another? For that, back to the timeline. In 1908, a guy named Hermann Minkowski invented a 4D frame called space-time. Einstein wasn't a fan, but by 1912, he knew his own approach wasn't working. So he had no choice but to accept Minkowski's. The math was a bit beyond him though, so he consulted some of his math friends. And in 1915, he finally figured it out after collaborating with David Hilbert. General relativity was finally a thing. The solution? Some accelerated reference frames are inertial reference frames. Before you freak out, let's review. Remember, physics isn't built on the things that are relative. It's built on what we call invariants. Those are the things that are the same from all points of view. Let's make a couple lists. I love lists. Relative things, length, distance, time, mass, energy, motion, the list goes on. Invariant things, the speed of light, space-time paths, electric charge, and I think that's it. In part 1 of this series, we saw a car moving with steady motion in a straight line. Let's take a look at its space-time diagram. As it moves through space, it also moves forward in time, represented by this slanted space-time path. That path is invariant, so it's measured the same by everyone. But separately, space and time are relative. From the clone's perspective, he's sitting still in space and only moving through time. On the space-time diagram, you can't change the path. It's invariant, so you have to change the frame itself. The clone's time axis lines up with his path, therefore no moving through space. The accelerating clone from this video has to be treated the same way. His space-time path looks like this, but he also thinks he's stationary. So his time axis looks like this. It's not straight, it's curved. Unfortunately, we can't see the curvature. We always see the frame as straight, even when it isn't. This makes things look a little weird. And the equivalence principle said accelerations were the same thing as gravity. So gravity isn't a force at all. Gravity is just an illusion created by our perspective. It's the result of a curved or warped frame. You think this squirrel is falling toward the Earth speeding up at 22 miles per hour per second? Nope. It's moving at a steady speed in a straight line through curved spacetime. You think the ISS is orbiting around the Earth in a circle? Nope. Steady speed, straight line, curved spacetime. Hopefully this cleared up some things for many of you, and maybe made your brain hurt a little bit. It's good for you every now and then. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments. I have a feeling you're definitely going to need a comment response video for this. Thanks for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and until next time, remember, it's okay to be a little crazy.